Okay, so about different types of the task. It can be, the task can be defined at node level, say the classification of the node. And it can also define the edge level, right? You want to predict, say, the property of the link, or just to predict whether the link exists or not. And also the prediction can be done at the subgraph level. So it's community level, or just all together at graph level. So you can just predict what's the property of the graph, right? And then you can directly predict at the graph level. And furthermore, we can even generate graphs using the generative models, right? So we can generate and evolve the graph. So here it shows some examples of that. So at the node level, for example, we want to predict the property of the node, right? So we want to categorize the online users or the items. So what is a category of that items? It's kind of at the node classification. There will be a link prediction to predict whether there's a missing links between the two nodes, just like the knowledge graph that I mentioned earlier, right? Say with the existing knowledge, we can build a knowledge graph with all those links between entities, but we can use those existing links to train a model to predict the missing ones, right? To complete the knowledge graph. And also the graph classification, for example, the molecule property prediction. As I know, some molecule property prediction takes a really long time to generate or to solve some complicated equations, differential equations, to derive that property. So with the power of graph networks, graph modeling, we can directly predict it and really speed up the time for the prediction process. And then here at the subgraph level, we can do the clustering, right, to detect if nodes form a community over there, and we can define a social circle of the nodes. And at graph level, so there will be a graph generation. So basically, it's the drug discovery. It's a really useful application of graphs to design the structures of the atoms to figure out what structure can be effective, say to be antibiotic, right? So to be effective in killing bacteria. And also the graph evolution, so it can be used to do physical simulations, which I'm going to show a very cool short movie later on to see that, you can see how the graph can evolve to really it looks like really realistic to comparing to the actual physical running or physical modeling aspect. So this graph ML task lead to really high impact applications. So,
yeah, just a very quick technical note. If you look at this list, you will see that there's node classification, but there isn't edge classification. There's link prediction, but not link classification.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is just because for any graph that you have vertices and edges that connect them, you can construct a sort of equivalent graph where the edges instead are vertices, and the vertices are the edges that then connect them. And so if you can do node classification on the vertices, if you want to do classification on the edges, you can just transform your graph into one where the edges are nodes instead. And then you can just use the node classification algorithm as is. So whether you technically do the transformation or you just conceptually do the transformation, either way, if you just do a search in the literature, you're not necessarily going to see edge classification as a term.
So in the following example, I feel they do predict some labels for the link, so we can discuss whether that's a case for the link prediction. Yeah. So next we just look through several examples for the research of the node level ML task, and also the edge level, subgraph level, and graph level. So let's first look at node level. So the first example is protein folding. I think everyone must hear about AlphaFold, right? So that's all about protein folding. So what is protein folding? So basically, I think one sentence to explain it is how to kind of use 1D to predict 3D. So it's using a 1D of amino acids to predict the 3D structure of the protein. And actually, the hypothesis or the proof is given in 60s, and it has won the Nobel Prize, that just one sequence of amino acids can all the information it needs to determine the 3D structure of protein, right? And then later on, people trying to, to learn this relationship, right, and to predict it, like how can we, find that function from these 1D amino acids to the 3D protein structures. And since the proteins are essential for lives, right, that's why this task is really important, because understanding the structure of proteins is crucial for for drug discoveries, to understand disease and all the others important questions to answer. Right. So here is just some results from I think it's from AlphaFold, right? So it computationally predict a protein's 3D structure based on the amino acid sequence, right? So you see the green one is experimental result, say some biological experiment, right? So from that result, so it's more kind of like the ground truth. And then this is blue. Blue is the computational prediction from the graph neural network. So you see the results are actually very close in terms of that. So you may wonder, why is node level? Well, since it's kind of predicting the structures, I think they define the problem by predicting, say, the positions of the amino acids in the 3D space, right? So basically you are predicting the coordinates of the nodes in the 3D space. So that's why it's a node level based model. And here it shows, I think there are lots of news and excitement raised about DeepMind's AlphaFold, right? And previously, computational method only achieve around 40% of accuracy. And with AlphaFold, the first version of AlphaFold increases to 60%. And then the second version of it can move up to nearly 90%. So there's even a news saying whether AlphaFold is already solved this problem. Yeah. So I think it's really exciting research of using graph neural network to solve important scientific problem.
By the way, I hear people speculating whether or not AlphaFold will eventually get the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, if it has a big impact, right? So usually Nobel Prize comes after when it has a real impact.
Yeah. It's always a few years later, but it could be.
Yeah, it could be if it's, yeah. So, and the second, I guess, Nobel Prize regarding to the protein structure. The first one is just a proof that this function should exist. And the second one is around, how can we derive that function? Yeah, so this is the key idea in AlphaFold. So it basically just define the 3D structures of proteins with the spatial graphs, right? And the nodes are amino acids in that sequence, and then the edges are the proximity between these acids, or the distances between these acids. right? So I think they do I think when I understand this is kind of like the embeddings of these acids, right? So this is the sequence. The sequence is from is all the existing species, right? So I think easy here is the human, fish, or snake, or chicken over here. So it's basically from all the unlabeled data. They're trying to figure out which the amino acids are kind of similar or which subsequence are similar from this unlabeled data. So they actually use this unlabeled data to kind of pre-train or inform the similarity of the nodes. And here is this learning about the edges, about the acid-acid node-to-node edges that in the end gives you the pairwise distances of these nodes. And these pairwise distances is used to generate this or to derive the coordinates of these nodes in the 3D space. So if you are very interested in the details, you can go to this paper that they publish on Nature, with the more details. Any questions, comment that you want to discuss on this?
I've got two, Jan, if I could. First one is to this example. How easy or difficult is it to add another dimension, quote unquote, to a graph? For example, if I wanted to look at the phosphorylation state of something, it's going to work on the existing nodes, but it's adding a different layer and it's going to greatly change edge behavior. Do you know anything offhand how that would work?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. I don't know until you try it. It's hard to say, especially in the deep learning world.
Sure.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Okay, well, and then the other questions are just a general one. What is the computational resources that are needed to do something like this versus like a neural network? Because I can see a lot of problems can be solved by either, but is there any general trends as far as resources?
General trends of resources. So even for this protein folding problem, I know that DeepMind has, all this computing power they have, and even for them, I think it takes them several days to train and predict to get their final prediction.
Okay, so I won't be doing it on my laptop anytime soon. Got it.
I don't. Well, once the model is trained, maybe once the model is trained, all the weights are fixed. So if your machine is, large enough to hold the model, it should be able to do that. But I think, as always, the training process will take still lots of computing resources.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, I'm learning this stuff alongside you guys. I'm not the expert on this, but for almost all graphs that occur in the real world, the connections are very sparse, right? You could have 100,000 nodes, but the degree of any node might be 10 or maybe at most 100. And so if you're working with the full matrix, which is square matrix size, the number of nodes, then it's this massive, very sparse matrix. And even if you use sparse matrix representation, so there's two problems with it, so one is just the volume of the data, and then our GPUs are not optimized yet for this. So if you're sort of familiar with sort of like the hardware lottery, hypothesis, we might have a AlexNet ImageNet moment kind of coming up for graph data science, but we're probably also going to need a hardware moment where somebody figures out, separate from the algorithms themselves, how to optimize the algorithms or how to build a modified version of an NVIDIA GPU that has, instead of say like tensor cores, it might have some kind of sparse graph cores, and then all of a sudden you get an 8x, 10x speed up, you know, when you're using those specialized hardware. So I don't think we have that yet, but Yan showed sort of the explosion of interest. And so I think we're on the cusp of seeing those types of things happening.
Yeah.
Can I insert a quick question here? Someone, may I?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so someone earlier had mentioned about, with sparse edges, basically, just showing a link, but you could do a transformation between the node to make the edge a node. Can you go over that again or kind of explain why? Because I mean, in my field, the edges have to have metadata in order for the edges to have actual meaning. And so apart from the node itself. So I don't know how we could do that kind of transformation, but if you go over that again, please.
Yeah, this is Ted. So basically all I was saying is that if you have a graph and let's just say you do have attributes, you do have properties associated with every vertex, and you have attributes associated with every edge. If the things that I call vertices are pairwise connected by edges, but in the same token, the edges, so to speak, are connected to each other where they share a common vertex. So in that sense, the vertices connect the edges. So conceptually, if you show me a graph with, say, whatever, 100 vertices and 200 edges, I can create a graph with 200 vertices, one that corresponds to each edge, and I can draw edges between them that correspond to the vertices that those edges have in common. And with that transformation, you still have to keep all the properties, the attributes associated with them, but I can just simply relabel what I call a vertex versus what I call an edge. And so for the purpose of an algorithm that can classify vertices, hypothetically, if you wanted to classify edges instead of classifying vertices, technically, you don't have to have a separate algorithm. You could just transform your graph and run the standard node classification algorithm. That's what I was just trying to point out in terms of why you will see the term node classification appear in literature a lot, but you just almost never see the term edge classification because people think of it as an isomorphic problem.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, talking about edge, we are coming to the edge level ML task. So the first one is recommender system, right? So users interact with items. We watch movies, purchase stuff, and we listen to music, right? So the nodes is the users and items, and the edges is the user item interactions. The interaction includes whether you watch it or not, whether you like it, or whether you have purchased it. And then the goal is to predict or to recommend these items to the users that they may like it. Right? So it's predict these missing links between the users and the items. There is a very popular, I think, paper, and also really, I think this is the largest graph-based recommender that I've seen. So it's from Pinterest, right? And this paper is published at KDD, the most premium data science conference in 2018. So it's calling about a graph convolutional neural network for web scale recommender system. And in this system, they are trying to, to recommend the pins to the users. So the pin, you can think of the pins here are the images, right? So it's kind of the visual. So the Pinterest is kind of using the visual elements that you can pin to your board. That the board is kind of, you can think of as a connection of similar pins. And this graph they built has about 10 billion nodes and more than 20 billion edges. So it's really a large graph. And then the task is to learn the embeddings of the node, and also to predict, to recommend pin, right? So basically to predict the missing link, right? Say if you give a query pin, so if you have this one already on the board, and then the Pinterest website is going to recommend this another cake-like a picture to you, right? Rather than a shirt, which is a totally different category that it won't interest you according to your historical likes. Right? So it's trying to figure out these missing links that closely related, to two pins that have similar, visual elements or the visual feelings. Right? So in their graph, so these are all the pins, and then the edges are the membership of pins to their corresponding boards. So the board is kind of a connection of similar pins, or there's the one theme of the board. So basically, one board will connect similar pins or similar pictures together. And so this is the existing data. And then you're trying to figure out, to automatically do this another, I would say, grouping or learning of this embeddings, so that you can always recommend, something similar to the user. Right. So the goal of this is one crucial step of this task is to learn the node embeddings, such as when these two nodes are similar, then the distance of their embeddings should be much smaller to those to the other two nodes when they are very different, right? So this embedding distance tells you the similarities. And when you do the recommendation, you can just directly calculate the distance and makes the closest items to show up. So I think this paper gains lots of interest is also because they optimize their system so that it's able to run on a billion scale, scale of the graph. Okay, and then the third example they talk about is the edge-based task is to predict the drug side effects. Right, so there are many patients can take multiple drugs to treat coexisting disease. Right, so around 46% of people between the age of or above 70s can usually take more than 5 drugs, right? And they want to predict, so given a pair of drugs, can we predict their adverse side effects? So why do we need this prediction? Why do we not just, clinical trial it? Well, you see there's lots of combinations, right? And also it takes time and also and cost to let people actually take this medicine and report their side effects, right? So it's really lots of combination to try out, right? So it's just impossible to figure out all these side effects of these pairs of drugs, right? So that's why they need prediction models to predict this based on the existing side effects they already know. So the nodes are the drugs and the proteins. So the triangle is a drug and the circle is a protein, and the drug interacts with the protein. So these are the proteins that the drug is going to affect. Right? And the protein also have relationship, right? So they also interact with each other. So the protein also exists a graph. And then the drug and protein has another connections. And then what they're trying to predict is the edge, kind of the edge labels between these two drugs, right? So when you take drug C and D together, So what is the side effect of when you take them two together? Right. So for example, the query is how likely when you take these two together will break down the muscle tissue. Right. So it's kind of to this case, it's kind of like predicting the label of these edges. Let's say you have lots of side effects. That is the label that you want to put on the edges of these drugs. So to Tad's point, so I understand that transformation, but I think to this case is you have the kind of the prior knowledge or the definition of the nodes and edges, and then maybe it's, I don't know, from the biological meaning point of view, is maybe not wise for them to do that node edge transformation. Do I understand it correctly?
Yeah, no, that's a cool example. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah. Okay, so this is one example of predicting the label of the edges. Okay, so then let's move on to the graph level. So first is the subgraph level. Well, I think all of us have used the Google Maps to tell us how to reach a destination from where we are, right? So it usually shows you several routes, and also on top of the routes, it also shows you the ETAs, right? So what's the time to arrive to that point if you take this route, right? So I don't know whether you have wondered how they come about the time for that. Right? So actually, they use every time when you query Google Maps, you are actually query a graph neural network system that predict this time. Yeah, so the nodes in this problem is the road segments. So they actually break down the roads into many segments, right? So the nodes are the segments, and the edges are just a connectivity between the road segments, right? So if these roads are connected, or these road segments are connected, then there will be an edge between. And then the prediction is the time of arrival. Let's say from A to B, so this is all the road segments, and then this is how you can reach from A to B over there. And here, I think this means the node embeddings, right? How you learn about this node, the traffic situation of this node. And they have published, I think it's a blog. I don't think they have published the paper yet, but they published some DeepMind blog about the model architecture for determining the optimal routes and their travel time. As they use the graph neural network to predict the ETAs of the routes ranked over there. Yeah, I think it's actually to my surprise because originally I thought they just use some statistics, right, and just connect the data from the people who are actually using the app, so they are aware of the traffic situation. But actually, they also need to do two forecasts, right? So based on current traffic situation, how the traffic will look like into future, right? So not just based on current traffic. So you need some prediction system to forecast into future of the traffic situation based on, say, based on yesterday, or all the historical traffic signals over there. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting idea, and they have also reported that with the graph neural network, they're able to increase the prediction accuracy by more than 30% across the world. So some places even more than 50%. So this is a subgraph level, and then let's move on to the graph level task. I see lots of graph level tasks is about molecules, because the molecules are just so natural graphs, right? So we have these atoms, and the graphs in the graph, the node is the atoms, and the edges are the chemical bonds of that, right? So each of this, so here is the antibiotic, right? So it's a drug, and each of the drug, you can think of it as just a small graph. Yeah, and then so this is the definition of the graph. So drug discovery is basically to kind of find the best graph structure, right? That is bacteria effective, right? That can constrain the growth of the bacteria, can kill the bacteria, right? So how can we define or find the graph structure of these atoms? So so they basically train a graph classification model. So this graph classification, so input is lots of graphs of the atoms or the graphs of the antibiotic, right? And then they, in the end, what they predict, I think, is the effectiveness of the antibiotic, right? How they are going to constrain the growth of the bacteria. Right, so given the graph, they are able to predict the effectiveness of that graph using the model. So when we are doing this, we can also do this using conventional molecule screening, but actually that will take a long time, and the pool of candidates can have relatively smaller range comparing it to this, right? So we can do a large scale, a much larger scale of screening in the beginning, and then we can pick all the most likely candidates to do this traditional or conventional screening or biological experiments, and then that will give us more kind of accurate or gradually shrink the pool of candidates to train our model. So in the training set is kind of is from this, is after this model validation step. But in the beginning, we can scan a pool of much larger molecules in the beginning. So this is one way to do it, that you can just predict the drug effectiveness, or you can directly generate graphs, right? So you can train a model to generate novel molecules with high drug likeness values. Right? So you can train a model to observe all the existing drug existing molecules that has this high drug likeness values, and they can learn about all these graph structures, and they use that information to generate new graphs, and that potentially can lead to new drugs. And also you can use it to grow a certain structure. Say this is your prior input, right? So you tell the machine this is something you want to start with, and then you let the model to figure out how to complete this graph. Yeah, I feel this is a very useful tool and assistant to help you fulfill the task. Yeah, so any comments? I believe from the audience, there must be someone working on this drug discovery, right? Especially those from biomedical or healthcare industries.
So I used to do the drug discovery the old-fashioned way, and the way before the slide before this one, or maybe it was that slide. Doesn't matter. Either one will go. So we would have a protein scientist that would come up with. They would try to make 100 candidates. Then we would test them on the right-hand side where you show the plate. Yep, and we would test 100 candidates that way, and then they would come up with the 10 that they liked, and then they would check to see the toxicity, and then we would try them in cell culture, and then we would have to try them with animal models to see if they work. And this would be years of research. So this can take 90% of the time down. So this is fabulous. And then the next model, when you're looking at modifying a molecule, where that's going to be very effective is antibiotic resistance. So we've got a very limited pool of antibiotics right now that have not developed resistance in bacterial communities. And something like this can make just enough modifications to bring them back to effectiveness again. And it's already been shown to work. So,
wow.
That's it.
Thank you for your comment here.
Yep.
Okay. Let's move to our last example. Is the physics simulation. So for this, I want to show a video. Let me whether I can find it. Okay. So yeah. So this is a ground truth and this is a prediction. So you see how they are, it's pretty cool to see, to predict all these motions of this tiny small particles. And it just looks like the real physical system. Yeah, so the underlying, so all of these materials, or liquids or solids, is modeled by these small particles. Arbitrary. So they are trained with the box shape, but the model can generalize very well to any shape. This looks like a game, I think. I know there is a game like you can block some, water. Yeah. So yeah. So this is about this. What is a physics simulation? And so you see it looks like real, right? Very cool predictions of the physics. Let me. Okay. So yeah, so a graph evolutional task is basically to predict how a graph will evolve over time. So as you see, this material or this mass is actually modeled by a graph of particles, right? So it's, each of the node can be, there's a property of each node, say their current position, their velocity, and also the property of these particles based on different materials, right? So that's the node. And then the edges is where they connect with this nearby particles, right? And then these edges can be some forces in the physics, right? And then they train a model to predict how these positions of these nodes will change, right? So this will be affected by these nearby nodes, right? Will also affected by the property of these nodes. And then they move each of the nodes to a new position. And these new positions again will become the input, right? And to pass through this transformation or prediction function again, right? So that is how you see this ends up in a movie, right? So it's every time you passing the new positions, the new velocities from the previous output. Yeah, so I feel this looks like it's really hard to tell. It's it's a real physical system or it's a prediction. It's really cool application. And this paper, I think, is published in 2020, so very recent publications. Okay, so that's all the examples I have for today. And yeah, so we have talked about like Y graphs and what's the challenges of that, like arbitrary shape, arbitrary properties and structures, right? So it's a very challenging problem to solve. And there are so many use cases for the graphs. And the graphs and the task can be defined at the node level, edge level, subgraph, or graph level task. And these are really compelling and at the same time challenging task. And I believe this task is going to have a real broad impact, right, for human beings, like for the drug discoveries and also the Google Map prediction. And actually, we are actually touched by many of these tasks already. And for the future meetup, so the next one will be given by Ted. And yeah, so we are going to mainly use these Stanford courses as our core materials. And also Ted is also suggesting some other books, right? Ted, if you want to put them in the chat. So those books also provides very good coding examples that we can look at along with this course material. And also, actually, this course has published some of their videos on YouTube. And again, when I watch it, it goes a little bit fast for that. So we try, so the purpose of this meetup is we try to slow it down a bit, and also to hear, all this interesting and exciting input from all of you, right? To have these active discussions on these course materials. And also for my past meetup recording some the language processing models and even some Kaggle tricks, you can find those videos on the Yan AI Talk YouTube channel. So you will see many interesting videos there. And also I'm going to publish these videos on that YouTube channel. Feel free to comment and also send us feedback, send us questions, or also you are always welcome to directly say to lead a session or to propose a topic to present. Yeah, so that's all for today's presentation. And I think we are right now open to any open discussions